We have about 10 minutes left in the session. You mentioned a new subject earlier. Do you want to unpack that?
Unpack it? No, I'd rather draw it. You keep asking me about the anger, doctor. But it's not anger. It's clarity. When I see them in the bars, they're so loud, so desperate to be seen. I sit with them. I draw them. They think I'm admiring them. And I am. Just not in the way they hope. They look at the sketch and see vanity. But when I look at them, I see a blank canvas that needs to be cut. I told you about the one at the Fox Plaza, right? The diplomat. He was shaking. Not from fear, but because he knew if he screamed, he'd lose more than his life. He'd lose his mask. You're writing that down. Good. Just remember what you told me when we started, Doc. Everything said in this room stays in this room. That is the rule, isn't it?
San Francisco, 1975. A city of liberation, neon, and fog. But in the shadows of the Castro, a predator is hunting with a sketchbook in one hand and a knife in another. He walked away because the men he hunted were too afraid to speak, and the doctor he confessed to was bound by law to stay silent. I'm your host, Matt, and welcome back to Homocidal Tendency. A quick briefing before we start. The story is visual. To really understand the Doodler, you need to see his work. I have uploaded the case files, the survivor sketches, and the behind-the-scenes evidence to our Instagram and other socials at Homocidal Tendency. Go look him in the eye. Also, do your part for the investigation. Follow the show. Leave some comments and rate us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It stops the algorithm from burying the bodies. Now, let's go to San Francisco. We're so used to the bumbling cop narrative in true crime, the lost evidence, the ignored phone calls, the laziness. But the tragedy of the Doodler case is the exact opposite. The police solved it. The world was just not ready to let them close the case. If you listen to enough true crime, you get used to a certain rhythm. You get used to yelling at your speakers. Why didn't they check the trunk? Why did they ignore that tip? Why did they let him go? Usually the villain in these stories isn't just the killer. It's the incompetence of the people trying to catch him. We're used to the stories where the system fails because the cops were lazy, prejudiced, or just bad at their jobs. But the Doodler case? This is different. And honestly, it's more frustrating. Because the detectives, Guilford and Sanford, didn't fumble. They were arguably two of the best homicide detectives San Francisco ever saw. They were the Soul Patrol, two black men navigating a department that didn't always want them there, investigating murders of gay men that the city didn't want to acknowledge. In another reality, in another decade, Guilford and Sanders would have been the heroes who closed the case in 6 months. They did everything right. They built the track perfectly. But they were trying to catch a monster in a world that was broken. So when you look back at 1975, don't blame the detectives. They had the handcuffs ready. It was the rest of society that refused to let them click shut. They weren't just cops. They were the first black homicide inspectors in San Francisco history. They were trailblazers, working within a department that was notoriously racist, investigating crimes against a community of gay men that the department was notoriously homophobic towards. They were the guys you called when you needed a case closed, but they were also the outsiders in their own precinct. Inspector Guilford, you can say he's the statesman, was the first black inspector in the San Francisco Police Department homicide detail. He was polished, incredibly intelligent, and socially adept. He didn't just burst down the doors, he navigated politics. He was so respected that he eventually left the force to become the deputy mayor of San Francisco under Dianne Feinstein. Guilford was the cool head. He understood the optics. He likely understood why the closeted victims were afraid, even if it frustrated him. He saw the big picture of how the city worked and how it was falling and failing these victims. And Inspector Sanders, the street enforcer, if you will. Sanders was tough, direct, and had an incredible instinct for the street. He started in the department when black officers weren't even allowed to drive patrol cars in certain neighborhoods. He climbed every rung of the ladder, eventually becoming San Francisco's first black chief of police in 2002. Sanders was the hunter. To him, letting a serial killer walk because of politics or shame was likely infuriated. He wanted this collar. The tragedy of their investigation wasn't a lack of clues. It was an abundance of inadmissible truth. Frustration A we'll talk about, the glass wall interrogation. Guilford and Sanders actually brought the suspect in. They sat across from him at the table. Imagine these two experienced detectives interrogating the Doodler. The Doodler was calm, perhaps even arrogant. He knew the game. Without the victim's testimony, the police only had circumstantial evidence. The suspect reportedly refused to speak, or if he did speak, it was in riddles, knowing that without a witness pointing a finger in court, he was safe. Let's move on to frustration B, the diplomat meeting. This is the most crushing part of their story. They tracked down the survivors, the European diplomat and the entertainer. Guilford and Sanders likely pleaded with him, "If you testify, we can stop him. If you don't, he's gonna kill again." These survivors looked the detectives in the eyes and essentially said, "My career is worth more than your justice." For Guilford and Sanders, who fought tooth and nail just to solve this case, watching powerful white men let a killer go to protect their social standing must have been a unique kind of hell. Guilford and Sanders walked out of that diplomat's office with empty hands. They had the weapon. They had the timeline. They even had the guy. But in 1975, the closet was stronger than the law. Sanders likely wanted to kick a door down. Guilford likely just lit a cigarette and looked into the fog. They realized that they weren't chasing a ghost. They were chasing a secret. And secrets don't testify. And now we get to frustration C, the systematic handcuffs, and the one I'm basing this whole story around. The Doodler targeted gay men because he knew they were safe victims. Guilford and Sanders were trying to prove that no one was a safe victim. They were fighting a DA's office that wouldn't prosecute without a slam dunk witness. They were fighting a police culture that often marked these files as NHI, no humans involved, which is slang for crimes against sex workers, addicts, or marginalized groups. Two black detectives were the only ones who cared enough to stop the killing of white gay men, but they were stopped by a system built by white straight men. Sometime around 1976 or 77, the police department received a phone call from a psychiatrist. In the police files, he is often referred to as Dr. Priest. This is either a pseudonym or it might actually be his real name. No one knows at this point. The doctor told police that a patient of his was struggling with violent compulsions and had confessed to being the Doodler. The thing is, in the mid-70s, California law regarding patient confidentiality was in chaos. The landmark case of Tarasoff versus Regents of the University of California was being fought in courts at this exact moment. The court ruled that therapists had a duty to warn victims. The court expanded that this duty is also to protect. The Doodler was operating in the legal gray zone between these rulings. The psychiatrist may have believed that violating confidentiality would strip him of his license or open him to a lawsuit, especially since the victims were random men in bars and not a specific named target, which was the standard for the Tarasoff lawsuit. The doctor likely felt he couldn't legally give the police the name or the tapes without a subpoena that the police couldn't get without more evidence. It was a catch-22. Like I said earlier, the police did interview the suspect based on this tip, but without the doctor's testimony or the survivor's testimony, they couldn't hold him. The psychiatrist is now deceased. When cold case investigators like Dan Cunningham went to look for the Dr. Priest's clinical notes in recent years, they found nothing. The medical records, which likely contained a written confession of 5+ murders, they're gone. Imagine being Guilford. You have a suspect who looks like the sketch. You have survivors who won't talk. And then you get a call from a doctor who says, "He told me he did it." It should have been a checkmate, but it wasn't. Because in 1975, the law was a mess. The Doodler didn't just hide in the shadows of the Castro. He did it in the blind spot of the law. He confessed to a man who was professionally bound to keep his secrets. The killer had found the one person in San Francisco who had to listen to him, but couldn't stop him. So that's the board. The pieces are all frozen in place. The diplomat is silent to save his career. The doctor is silent to save his license. And Detective Guilford and Sanders are trapped behind a wall of red tape, staring at a suspect who know is guilty, but they cannot touch. We know why the justice system stopped. We know why the investigation went cold. It suffocated under the weight of secrets, shame, and legal technicalities. San Francisco in the mid-70s was a city in transition. The summer of love was dead and buried. The vibe had shifted from hippie optimism to something grittier, something harder, more hedonistic. To understand the Doodler, you have to understand where he hunted. San Francisco, 1974. It was the epicenter of a revolution. The Castro was exploding. Men were arriving by busloads from Kansas, Ohio, and Texas, running away from fathers who didn't understand and towns that didn't want them. They came looking for paradise. What they found was a city on the edge of a nervous breakdown. The 70s were darker. The Zodiac Killer had already turned the Bay Area into a ghost story. The zebra killers were hunting people on the sidewalks just months before. The police were overwhelmed, and the city was exhausted. And in the middle of this chaos, there was a blind spot. Places like the truck stop and the cabaret. To the straight world, these places were invisible, or worse, they were punchlines. But to the Doodler, they were a buffet. He knew that in 1974, a gay man in a bar was already a criminal in the eyes of the law. He knew they couldn't call for help. He walked into a party that the rest of the world was trying to ignore, and he started turning off the lights one by one. He wasn't just grabbing people off the street. He was navigating a complex, segmented world with its own rules, dress codes, and even hierarchies. Gay San Francisco wasn't a monolith. It was divided into tribes and territories. The Doodler's ability to move between them suggests that he was a chameleon, someone who could code switch between the gritty leather bars and the upscale cocktail lounges. So let's talk about some of these tribes or subdivisions. The Castro. This was the new booming center. The men here cultivated a hyper-masculine look known as the Castro clone look. It involved tight Levi's, plaid shirts, combat boots, and thick mustaches. It was a reaction against the effeminate stereotypes of the past. It was loud, it was proud, and it was very, very white. Let's talk about Folsom Street, or also known as the Miracle Mile. This was the hardcore leather district. Industrial, gritty, dark. Bars like Phoebe's and the Barracks were here. It was about the BDSM, motorcycles, and anonymity. It was dangerous in a way that it was considered thrilling until the murder started. And then there's the Tenderloin. Before the Castro, this was the main neighborhood. But by 1975, it was grittier, mixed with hustlers, drag queens, and older men. It was less liberated and more underground. The Doodler's choice of locations tells us a lot about his psychology. He didn't just stick to one type of victim. So let's talk about some of those locations. Let's talk about the truck stop. This wasn't just a bar. It was a 24-hour diner/bar hybrid. It was near the Castro. It was kind of like a transition space where people went after last call to sober up or maybe to find a final hookup. It was bright, loud, and transient. For the Doodler to sketch here, he had to be bold. He was hiding in plain sight, using the noise and the chaos of a 24-hour diner to disarm his victims. Let's talk about the cabaret. It was located near the financial district or North Beach. This was more of an uptown spot. It catered to more of the professional older men crowd, perhaps men who were more closeted and didn't fit into the leather or the clone scene. This is likely where he met the diplomat. These men weren't looking for a leather daddy. They were looking for conversation and art. The Doodler played the role of the sophisticated artist here. And now we have to talk about the handkerchief code. So in 1975, there were no apps to swipe left or right on, no grinder, no scruff. The men had to use the code, and the one code we're going to start with is the handkerchief code. Men wore color bandanas in their back pockets, colors for specific fetishes they were into. It was a silent language. Another thing was the eye contact. Cruising relied on prolonged eye contact. A specific look could mean, I'm interested. The Doodler, he hacked this code. Instead of a subtle eye contact, he used a sketchbook. It was a prop that allowed him to stare at men openly without being aggressive. It gave him an excuse to approach anyone. Hey, may I draw you? It bypassed all the complex social rules of cruising and created an instant intimacy. Now let's talk about his modus operandi. It was a mix of soft skills, charm, art, conversation, and extreme violence. He lured victims in with gentleness and finished them with rage. Most predators use force or surprise. The doodler used flattery. He always carried a sketchbook and charcoals or pencils. This wasn't just a hobby, it was his hunting tool. He would sit in a bar, like the truck stop or cabaret, and sketch a target from across the room. This was brilliant and terrifying. It made the victim feel seen and admired. It established him as an artist, a non threatening, sensitive observer. It required the victim to sit still and look at him, creating instant intimacy and eye contact. He almost exclusively targeted white men. Investigators believe he exploited the racial dynamics of the 1970s San Francisco. In a segregated gay scene, a young black man entering a white space might often be seen as exotic or rough trade, which is a dated term for a partner from a different class or race who offers a grittier experience. He subverted this expectation. He wasn't rough, he was cultured. This confused the victim's radar, making them feel safe enough to leave with him. He never killed at the pickup spot, he always moved them. Maybe proposal. Let's go somewhere quiet. Let's go see the ocean. They usually left in the victim's car. This gave the victim a false sense of control, but it trapped them. Some of the spots he liked were Ocean Beach. The dunes offered total darkness, and the sound of the waves covered the screams. Another spot was Golden Gate Park, and they had dense thickets, and they had the cruising spots, and they provided cover. And then there was Land's End. It was dangerous cliffs and rocky terrain. These spots, this is where the gentle artist mask fell off and the weapons came out. Let's talk about the weapon. Typically, he used a knife with a long blade. And then there were some other cases where he used what was available, like a rock or a branch. And then moving on to the timing, police believe that he attacked during moments of intimacy. The evidence of this is victim Kavanaugh had minimum defensive wounds. This implies he was attacked while he was relaxed, perhaps embracing the killer or undressing, completely unaware of the threat that was coming. Then there were the attacks themselves, the rage, like there was so much rage. The violence was often over excessive, multiple stab wounds to the front and back. This wasn't just about killing, it was about obliterating the person, slashing the throat, the common finish, ensuring the silence. And his motive, it didn't usually involve robbery. He wasn't killing for wallets. He was killing to kill. The primary motive was just the kill itself. And lastly, he left the bodies where they fell. He relied on the location itself. Tides, fog, remote bushes. That's what delayed the discovery. He didn't try to hide the bodies. Okay, so let's chronologically go through the known victims. The first victim was Gerald Kavanaugh. His date of death was January 24th, 1974. Gerald was 49 years old, a Canadian immigrant who worked in a mattress factory. By all accounts, he was a gentle, quiet man. He wasn't the party boy. He was an introvert who kept to himself. He was found on Ocean Beach, lying face up in the sand near the waterline. This was the police's first look at the doodler's rage. Gerald wasn't just stabbed. This was overkill. Multiple stab wounds to the front and back. But there's a chilling detail. His defensive wounds, they were minimal. This suggests he was taken completely by surprise, most likely while he was relaxed, trusting the man he was with. Then there's the next victim, victim number 2, Joseph Stevens. His date of death was June 25th, 1974, 5 months later. He was 27 years old and a minor celebrity in the scene. He was a female impersonator, or a drag queen, if you will, and a comedian at a bar called Finocchio's, a legendary club in San Francisco. He was funny, talented, and very much, quote unquote, out in this world. He was found at Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park. It's a popular cruising spot, but it's also a public park. Moving from a quiet factory worker to a well-known performer, this shows that the doodler's confidence was growing. He wasn't just picking off the invisible. He was hunting men who could be missed. Stevens was stabbed repeatedly, similar to Kavanaugh. This murder rocked the gay community because it was people This murder rocked the gay community because people knew Jay. It wasn't just a random body anymore. It was a performer they had seen on stage. Then we move on to victim 3, Klaus Christmann. Klaus was 31, a German national. But unlike the others, Klaus had a shield. He was married and he had 2 children. He was found at Ocean Beach. So back to the first location. When police found Klaus, he was fully clothed, but his throat had been slashed. The oddest detail, he had a makeup tube in his pocket. Maybe it was something to out him, or perhaps it was just left as a prop from the encounter. But he was a family man. His death didn't just end his life, it outed him to his wife and his children in the most brutal way possible. The police reportedly struggled to even identify him at first because he was arguably living 2 separate lives. And then we move on to victim 4, Frederick Kappen. The date of death was May 12th, 1975. It's nearly a 1-year gap since the last victim. Fred was 32, a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War. He was in the Navy and a nurse. He had won medals for saving lives under fire. He was tough, experienced, and he was physically capable of a fight. He was found behind a sand dune at Ocean Beach. And this is where the profile shifts. Kappen, like we said, was a war vet. Stabbing him wouldn't be as easy as the others. The fact that the Doodler took down a man with combat experience suggests that the killer was either incredibly strong, or more likely, the initial attack was so sudden and deceptive that Kappen's training didn't even matter. But back to the gap of almost a year. It's kind of weird. Where was the Doodler? Was he in jail for something else? Was he trying to stop? Or are there other victims we just didn't find? More on that later. And now on to victim 5, the last of the conical victims, Harold Goldberg. His date of death was June 4th, 1975. Harold was 66 years old, a Swedish sailor. He was the oldest victim. He was found in a decomposed state in a cave near Lincoln Park, the Lincoln Park golf course. His throat was slashed, but the decomposition made evidence collection nearly impossible. His death marks the end of the confirmed spree, like we said. It also breaks the pattern of age. He was much older. And the locations, a cave, not an open beach or a park. It suggests the Doodler might have been desperate or devolving in his method. The official count is 5 deaths and 3 survivors, but almost everyone close to the case, including the original detectives and the modern cold case unit, believes the number is much, much higher. In 1977, the San Francisco Chronicle ran a story where investigators estimated the true number of victims might be closer to 14. So let's break that down. Here is a list of the suspected victims. If you include anyone outside the confirmed 5, it has to be Warren Andrew. He is the key to the modern investigation because he's the one who fought back. The attack was April 27th, 1975. It was at Land's End, a rocky clifftop park area known for cruising. Here's the deviation from the normal MO. The Doodler usually stabbed his victims. Andrew was found battered and unconscious. His head was crushed with a rock and a tree branch. He never woke up, and he died several weeks later. Because the weapon was different, police didn't officially link him. The Doodler likely lost his knife, or maybe the struggle went wrong, forcing him to use a rock. Because it was a physical brawl involving rocks and branches, the police believe that the scene holds the best chance for DNA, maybe skin cells or blood transfer, more so than a clean knife attack. Then there's the potential of the apartment victims. The Doodler was known for outdoor attacks, but then there were other gay men murdered in their apartments during this exact time frame, who also fit the profile. One example of this is Robert Pickney. It was May of 1974. He was a 32-year-old Filipino man. He was found stabbed in his apartment. He was killed right in the middle of the Doodler spree. The method of stabbing was similar, frenzied and overkilled, but the location, indoors, made police hesitant to link it. However, if the Doodler met him at a bar and went back with him to his home instead of the beach, it fits perfectly. Then there's the silent victims, or the ones that were just wounded and then walked away. This is the most disturbing category. We know about the diplomat and the entertainer because the police found them, but how many others were attacked and simply just didn't tell anyone? Investigators believe there were likely dozens of men who showed up at San Francisco emergency rooms with slash wounds or stab wounds during the 1974 and 1975 period. When doctors asked, they were likely like, "What happened? These men likely lied. I was mugged." I fell. It was an accident. Why? Because admitting you were stabbed by a trick that you picked up at a bar was a confession of a crime. They chose to stitch up the wounds and keep the secret rather than to risk a police report. That would out them to their employers, to their families, to their friends. 5 men were dead. The bodies were scattered across the beaches of San Francisco, like discarded sketches. But the Doodler made mistakes. He wasn't perfect. He didn't always finish a job. These were the lucky ones, and they had the scars to prove it. They had seen his face. They had heard his voice. They were the key to locking him away forever. Detectives Guilford and Sanford, they found them. They brought them in. They sat them down. And that's when the detectives learned the hardest lesson of 1975. Sometimes survival is just another form of silence. Police files indicate there were 3 distinct survivors who were attacked, but they escaped. Their identities were so fiercely protected that even today, 50 years later, their names are not public. But we do know what they were. The first one was the diplomat. This is the most famous figure in the case files. He was described as a ranking European diplomat stationed in San Francisco. He met the Doodler at a restaurant, likely the Cabaret, had a sketch done, and agreed to go back to his apartment. The Doodler attacked him with a knife. The diplomat fought back or screamed, causing the Doodler to flee. When police found him, he was cooperative up to a point, but when asked to testify in open court, he refused. The reason being would be the scandal. As a diplomat, his outing would have caused an international incident for his home country. He essentially told the police, "I will not destroy my life to solve this case." And then he shortly left the US and returned to Europe. And then number 2 was the entertainer, described as a nationally known entertainer. Rumors have swirled for decades about who this was. Names of famous 70s actors and singers often pop up, but it has never been confirmed who it was. In 1975, being outed as a gay was a career death sentence for a mainstream celebrity. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a breach of contract. Yeah, that's fucked up. I'm glad I'm like an 80s kid. Not that I'm a celebrity, but anyways. The survivor made a cold calculation. Testifying against the Doodler would mean admitting he was in a gay bar or he was cruising. He chose his audience over justice. And then there was the third man. He's often overlooked in the retelling because less is known about his status, but he followed the lead of the other 2. His refusal to comment or testify, it cemented the wall of silence. If powerful men wouldn't talk, then an average man wasn't going to stick his neck out either. So at this point, detectives Guilford and Sanford have a suspect in custody, most likely detained on unrelated charges, but brought in for questioning. They're confident. They bring in the survivors to view a lineup. The survivors, they look at the lineup. They identify the Doodler. They point him out. That's the man. But the twist? They identify him only for the police knowledge. They explicitly state they will not say those words in a courtroom. And this really pisses me off. But anyways, moving on. Without a sworn testimony, a lineup identification is useless in court. You cannot cross-examine a whisperer. The police had the who, but they didn't have the witness. Imagine this. 2 black detectives who fought their way into a department that didn't want them, standing next to a European diplomat and a TV star. They were all looking through the glass at the same young man. The diplomat knows him. The star knows him. The cops know him. But the glass between them wasn't just a window. It was a closet. And in 1975, that glass was bulletproof. The survivors, they walked out the door, back to their careers, back to their secrets. And because they walked away, the Doodler walked away. He didn't escape because he was a genius. He escaped because the victims had more to lose than he did. For over 40 years, the Doodler file, it gathered dust. But in 2018, the San Francisco Police Department Cold Case Unit, led by Inspector Dan Cunningham, decided to take another shot. The world had changed. DNA technology had advanced. And most importantly, the social stigma of being gay had lessened significantly. The silence that protected the killer was finally breaking. In February 2019, police released a new image. The original sketch, the 1975 sketch showed a young, slim black man, roughly 19 to 25 years old, with a cap and a calm expression. The new sketch showed what he would look like today, a man in his mid to late 60s. The police have put serious money on the table. A $100,000 reward has been offered for information leading to an arrest. This wasn't just about the greed of the people, it was a signal. It told the public, we're serious. This isn't just a dusty file, we want him. Then, in a stunning move during a 2019 press conference, the police admitted they have a specific person of interest. He's alive. He lives in the East Bay, across the bridge from San Francisco. Inspector Cunningham actually went to interview him. Imagine him, knocking on the door of an old man in a quiet neighborhood. The man is no longer the slender artist, he's a senior citizen. The man was reportedly polite, but firmly refused to answer any questions without a lawyer. He didn't run. He didn't panic. He just closed the door. Being a person of interest isn't enough for an arrest warrant. They needed the one final piece of evidence, DNA, or maybe a new witness to cross the threshold. Today, the Doodler would likely be in his early 70s. He might be your neighbor. He might be the quiet man sitting on the park bench in Oakland, sketching the birds, maybe. The police, they know his name. They know where he lives. Inspector Cunningham has looked him in the eye, but looking isn't enough. In 1975, the law stopped the detectives because the victims wouldn't speak. In 2026, the law is stopping them because the science hasn't quite caught up. And because of that, somewhere in the Bay Area, an old man is watching the news, wondering if the knock on the door is finally coming. That means for 50 years, he has been waking up every morning. He has been drinking his coffee. He has been watching the sunset. He has been maybe paying his taxes and waving at his neighbors. He got to have a life. He got to grow old. Now that we think about it, everything else that's happened in this country over the last 50 years, what about the war on drugs? Think about how many people, specifically black people and brown people, have been thrown into a concrete box for 10, 20, 30 years because they had a bag of weed in their pocket. We've built an entire prison industrial complex to lock up people for trying to feel good, for trying to escape, for non-violent offenses. We destroyed families over an ounce of a plant. But a man who hunted human beings for a sport, a man who preyed on the vulnerable and slashed throats in the sand, he got a pass. Why? Because the system was so broken, so obsessed with the morality of who these men were sleeping with, it couldn't function. It's the ultimate indictment of American justice. You can rot on a cell for getting high, but you can walk free from murder, as long as you kill the right kind of victim. The Doodler is free today, not because he was a mastermind. He's free because we were too busy policing people's private lives to protect their actual lives. This case is not a ghost story. It's not a myth from 50 years ago. The San Francisco Police Department, they have a name. They have a face. But they need that one final link to make it stick. And that might be you. First of all, go to our Instagram or the show notes right now. I've posted the side-by-side sketches, the young artist from 1975, and the age progression image of what he looks like today. Look at his eyes. Look at the shape of his face. Secondly, think about your history. Do you have any uncles, cousins, friends who lived in the East Bay or San Francisco in the mid-70s? Do they know a quiet guy who carried a sketchbook? Did they mention a weird encounter at the truck stop or the cabaret? If you know something, even if it feels small, even if it feels like maybe it's just a rumor, say something. You can contact the San Francisco Police Department Cold Case Unit directly at 415-553-1145. You can remain anonymous. The diplomat couldn't speak. The entertainer wouldn't speak. The doctor wasn't allowed to speak, but we can. For Homicidal Tendency, I'm Matt. Follow us on Instagram at Homicidal Tendency for photos and behind-the-scene looks. If you like the show, give us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Also, feel free to leave comments on the socials. It'll help me improve the show. But most of all, stay safe, stay loud, and never let them silence you.